Ladies and gentlemen, Mary Beth. Do you want this one?
Good job, good job. Okay, let's start. So, when you see this word risk, what do you think of? A lot of people think of fear or avoidance. For some people, risk is a four-letter word. But for me, risk is a really important element of happiness. And I'd like to tell you a few stories about that. When I was a child, my parents would load me and my three brothers into our station wagon, and we would head down to Pine Mountain, Georgia, to Callaway Gardens, and for vacation. And so it was the 70s, so my parents would be off playing tennis, and we would be off doing all these activities for kids. And my favorite was the circus tent. So you'd climb to the top of this tent to a trapeze bar, and you'd hold on to the bar, and you'd put your feet on the bar, and then you'd wait for the camp counselor to yell, "Drop!" And then you'd fall back into the net, about 2 stories down. And it was really exhilarating and terrifying, and it was my first experience of risking my way to happiness. Now, fast forward to today. Today, I lead Charleston Jazz, and we run the Charleston Jazz Orchestra, the Charleston Jazz Festival, and the new Charleston Jazz Academy. And what I've noticed is that jazz artists are risk takers. In fact, risk, you could say, is at the heart of jazz. That's because a great jazz musician is really taught to play between the notes, improve a song on the fly, play it differently each time, and that takes guts to do that. So I went on to Charleston Jazz. So 2.5 years ago, before I did that, I was a tech marketing executive. I did that for 30 years. And I was a lot like this trapeze artist that was just sort of swinging along on that oh-so-familiar bar for too long. I needed to really reach out and take a risk. I love the arts. My dad was a collector of big band albums. My grandmother was a piano teacher. I love jazz. I knew I wanted to do something that was more about giving back at this stage than just making money. But I caution people, there is a risk. Anyone who's in the corporate world who wants to move to the nonprofit space, there's a 3-factor, I always say. You're going to make 1/3 of your salary. You're going to work 3 times as hard. You're going to wear 3 times as many hats. But this is important. You're going to have triple the joy. And it is such a pleasure to work with so many talented artists. This brings me to a recent book called The Blue Zones of Happiness. And it was written by Dan Buettner, and he talks about the 3 P's of happiness, which are pleasure, purpose, and pride. And he says those 3 P's are braided together in the world's happiest people. And he also says you've got to get out of your comfort zone sometimes if you want to see where the magic happens and be happy. So I ask you, if you're stuck in your art or your career or even your love life, where do you need to get out of your comfort zone? So for me, travel is a great way to get out of your comfort zone. Case in point, in 2004, I was feeling stuck. I needed more clarity in my life. So I decided to take a trip to India, and I wanted to dive into yoga and meditation and really dive into where that all began. And while I was there, I met a Hindu Swami by the name of Natarajan, also known as Muni. And, he was 21 when he entered the monastery. He was American-born. He had traveled all through India. He taught meditation to younger monks. And he even did a 41-day water fast. So when I got home, I met my 2 best friends from 2nd grade, and I pointed to this picture, and I said, if he wasn't a monk, I know he'd be my husband. I feel like I've known him for lifetimes, and I think he's the kindest person I've ever met. I never thought he would leave, but 3 years later, in his own words, I went to bed one night, positive I would stay in the monastery forever. I woke up the next day knowing I would leave immediately, and we got married 6 months later. Yeah. So I shouldn't be surprised he took a leap like that. I shouldn't be surprised he took a risk, because before going into the monastery, Mooney was a jazz musician. And jazz musicians take risks, right? So he had quite a career as a jazz musician. All before the age of 21, he had performed with Quincy Jones. He had performed with Cannonball Adderley. He toured with the Glenn Miller Orchestra. He played with Stan Kenton, Woody Herman. These were the biggest names in jazz at the time. He sessioned with Santana. Then he went to Hawaii, and he was the house drummer for Don Ho at his famous nightclub. So now he's in a different phase of life, right? And sometimes we have to take risks to go from phase to phase. He started off as a jazz artist, then he's a monk, and now he's an artist and a husband and a meditation teacher on Daniel Island, and I lead a jazz organization. So I like to point out, though, that be careful of the shoulds. If you're thinking about taking a risk and you're hearing yourself say, well, I should do that, or someone is saying you should do that, be careful, because shoulds are often well-meaning, but often based on fear or rigid training and not that helpful. Instead, wait till your heart sings that you must do something. According to the philosopher Joseph Campbell, if you follow your bliss, doors will open for you where once there were only walls. So if you're going to take a risk, follow your bliss. But most importantly, live your life like a jazz musician. Don't fear mistakes. According to Miles Davis, there are none. Trust yourself, take action, and risk your way to happiness. Thank you.